My name is Mollie Burns. I'm the reference librarian here. And what I'm trying to do is tell some stories that you may or may not know. Some are more famous than others. I'm going to try to give you an idea of the person that is involved here, because I don't want to further sensationalize the terrible loss to their families, and I want to create the idea that these were living and breathing human beings, you know, had hopes and dreams and everything like us. So I want to talk a little bit about the sign. Now, Hollywood was originally a development, and the advertisement was Hollywood Land. So it was the whole entire word up on the canyon until the 1940s, when there was an earthquake and they decided not to replace the land. But this is how we know it. This is what we see. This is what you conjure in your mind, is this famous sign. At one time it was lit up with little light bulbs to advertise that subdivision. Also happens to be very near to where the movie studios started. Now, a lot of people come to Hollywood wanting to be a star or wanting to act, and a lot of them come from the stage to begin with. Sometimes it translates well and sometimes it doesn't, because when you're on stage, I am trying to project my voice out to the back row. But when talkies started, they had boom mics. So it was hard sometimes for somebody who was a stage performer to make that transition. That's why some early films seem a little over the top. I'm going to start with a lesser known person, and her birth name was Millicent Lillian Entwistle. She was born in Scotland and emigrated to the United States. But they called her Peg. So where you get Peg from Millicent, I don't know. I don't really understand how Jack is a short for John when they're the same amount of letters. Don't get it. But they just called her Peg. So she was born on February 5th, 1908. She was a star of stage, and she appeared in one movie in her career. Her parents, they're going to say they divorced, but it's still kind of sketchy, when she was 2. So after they'd moved to the United States, she and her brothers and herself moved to New York. Her father was an actor, and her uncle was actually a stage manager for an actor on Broadway. And shortly after they got here, in 1922, her father was tragically killed in a hit-and-run accident. So she was sent to live with her uncle in New York for a little while. So they were around when they first came here, they were around Cincinnati and New York area, which I find kind of strange, that connection, but I'm not really sure why they were in the same spot. So she started acting rather early. She, at the age of 17, starred in a Broadway play, and it was called The Wild Duck. And a young Betty Davis saw her perform on this Broadway play. So this is little Betty Davis child sees Peg perform, and she says, you know, I want to be exactly like Peg Entwistle when I grow up. So she had an influence on Miss Betty Davis, yes. So she starred in many, many plays. Very good as a stage performer. She was also accepted into the prestigious Theater Guild in New York, where she would change characters back and forth each week. So she really had a lot of building her chops, so to speak, switching characters, learning more things. But then she ended up getting typecast as a comedian, and she really didn't like that. She wanted to do more drama, but they kind of pushed her that way. And her longest running play was in 1927. It was a hit, and it was called Tommy, and she performed for 232 performances. So that was the one that she was most famous for, and that she was most remembered. So in 1927, the same year, she married an actor named Robert Keith, but she found out that he was actually married to another woman, so she filed for divorce. Also, he had a 6-year-old son whose name was Brian Keith. Anybody recognize that from Family Affair? Just a little, it's amazing. It's like the 6 degrees, right? There's 6 degrees of separation. So she was always cast as the comedian. She didn't much like that. She wanted to do more emotionally charged scenes. She wanted to play roles with conviction. She wanted to get away from this silliness. She was really trying to work her scenes up to a pitch and an emotional crescendo, But they always made her be the funny woman, so she wasn't too happy about that. So in 1932, she made her last appearance on Broadway, and it was with Miss Laureate Taylor. Now the problem with this play was that Laureate Taylor was an alcoholic, and she got so drunk that she wouldn't show up for the performances. So this play closed after 2 outings, 2 sessions, because this lady didn't show up. So the actors and crew were promised to get a part of the box office. This is going to be a big play with big name person. They're supposed to get part of the box office, but what they really did was get ripped off. And what they got was 1 week of pay and no box office, because this thing closed because unfortunately, their main star messed it up by not showing up. So, 1932, anybody think about what's going on economically in the 30s?
The Depression.
Yes, and it might cause a lot of shows not to go on or just not financed properly, correct? So in 1932, Peg decides that she's going to go out to California where another uncle of hers lives. And so she went out and she got a film role, her one and only, for RKO Pictures. And it was called The 13 Women. Now this movie was based on a book by the same name. And the book was a suspense novel. And the premise was that the mastermind criminal wanted to get revenge on these sorority sisters by engaging a fortune teller in giving them false horoscopes or fortunes that either led them to commit suicide or to kill each other. So really dramatic, insane thriller book, and she got the part in it. And she had a bigger part in it. But before it was going to be released, they cut her lines from several scenes down to just what you just saw. So suffice to say, she was not too happy with that. Turned out they were going to delay sending that movie to the theaters. So she got a little disillusioned and depressed. And on September 8th, 1932, a woman was taking a hike over there by that Hollywood land sign, and she found a woman's shoe, a jacket, and a purse. And when she opened up that purse, there was a suicide note in it. And so she looks down the canyon and finds a body. So she contacts the police. Now, actually, Peg was not identified until a few days later by her uncle, who noticed that she's been missing for a couple days. But her suicide note was actually published in the newspaper. And it was signed P.E. So the uncle realized that when Peg said she was going out with some friends that night, that must be her. It's got her initials, the description matches. So he was the one to have to identify her, and it's really kind of sad. So what the police surmised was that she had climbed up the letter H. A workman had left a ladder there, and she had climbed up that H in Hollywood land, had climbed up and jumped to her death. And what he figured out was that, obviously she's not telling the truth about going out with some friends. She never came back. And then this note was published. And what the note said, I am afraid, I am a coward. I am sorry for everything. If I had done this a long time ago, it would have saved a lot of pain, and then signed PE. So fortunately for those of us around today, we do have access to suicide prevention hotline, which you can either text or call at 998. So if you're feeling like you're having issues, so. Well, there she is. So that is one of the very first tragedies to take place at Hollywood. So I'm going to move on. I'm going to talk a little bit about Isadora Duncan. Now, she was the first person to do what is called modern dance. She kind of invented it from naturalistic movements that she made. She kind of had this outrageous bohemian lifestyle where she didn't marry her boyfriends, she had children out of wedlock, just all kind of things that just weren't heard of in 1927. But in context, what happened right before the 20s? Big world event.
World War I.
Yes. So, given in context of this, imagine the whole world is shattered. It's all gone to war, many casualties. It was a great disruption. So in reaction to that, there was this whole modernist movement, and she was a founding mother of that, where you can't create anything new because you're basing it on things that have gone before. You want to be modern. You want to create your own. So she was actually born in San Francisco, and her father was a banker and also a mining engineer, and her mother was a dancer. Well, their parents got divorced early on, but right before the divorce, good old daddy, Charles Duncan, the banker, was using money from two of his banks to finance his stock speculations. So he avoided prison, but he didn't avoid the divorce. So Isadora is being raised by a single mother out there, and the mother's doing anything she can to make ends meet. So she starts teaching the neighborhood kids how to dance, and of course Isadora is really good at it. So Isadora decides that she's going to drop out of school at the grand old age of 10 years old and help her mother with the dance, right? So anyway, she improvised her dancing. It was meant to be free-flowing. She was very famous for wearing like a Greek-style dress because she was inspired by Greek vases and the arts of the time. But she didn't like ballet. The ballet was too rigid for her. And so she was the darling in Europe because she was new, and this is great, and this is modern, and this is something we've never seen before. So she became very free-flowing, but it didn't go over very well in the United States. They didn't like this new dance stuff. weren't too crazy about it. So she decided she was not appreciated in the United States. So where did she go? Europe. So she started performing in the ballrooms and in the parlors of wealthy people. And so she was at a mansion that one of these artists had rented, and she was dancing on the tabletops to 300 people during this party. And then they had drank 3,000 bottles of champagne at this crazy party because she was there and she was great. So this is actual film footage, which is pretty amazing for the time, for it just being somebody's house. So she had a very interesting life. She opened her own schools of dance in France and in Europe, and she had her little troupe of girls that would dance, and they nicknamed the Isadorables. So she had her own little group there, you know, the Isadorables. But then, unfortunately, she had some tragedy strike in her life. She had had 2 children with her significant, and tragically, the 2 children and their nanny had drowned when their car wrecked into the Seine River. And she was so distraught by that she spent a long time recovering with that kind of grief. And then in 1922, she married a poet, and his name was Sergei Yesenin. Now, can you guess where he might be from with a name like Sergei?
Russia?
But back then it was the
Soviet Union.
correct. Very good. Man, you guys are good.
We're old.
No, you know it. You know real history. I am impressed.
You are.
So the couple traveled back to the United States to try to see if she could revive her little stage performance. But unfortunately, the United States weren't too keen on having this person from the Soviet Union over it because they had what they called an anti-Bolshevik paranoia. So they were not welcome in the United States. So back to the Soviet Union they go this time. Now, unfortunately, Sergei, he suffered from deep depression and mental illness. So he decided he would take his own life. And so she struggled again, you know, with severe emotions because of it, which would be normal. And finally, she decided to have an outing with her friends and her sister in Nice, France. And her sister had given her this long scarf for her birthday. And she gets in the car, and it was reported that she said in French, "So I live again." And so she went out in that automobile. Now, back in those days, some automobiles were made with the spoke kind of wheels. And unfortunately, that long flowing scarf out the convertible got wrapped around that wheel, and it actually strangled her. So that's another tragic end to a Hollywood hopeful. I know. I'm sorry. It's just the topic. So there she is, and there is your headline. Now, a quote from her is, "The true dance expression is of serenity. It is controlled by the profound rhythm of inner emotion." So there she is, poor thing. It's just, yeah. She actually died when she was 50 years old, so the other 2 were younger. Peg was 23. Oh, here's somebody you might recognize. Yeah? All right, good old Carole Lombard. She was born October 6, 1906. And did Kaylee cover what her real name was?
Yeah.
Does anybody remember?
Was that Lucille LeSueur? No.
No. It was Jane Alice Peters. Good old Jane Alice. Doesn't quite flow, but that's okay. So she was actually born to a wealthy family in Fort Wayne, Indiana. But she was raised in Los Angeles, again, by a single mother because I guess their marriage didn't work out. So at the ripe old age of 16, she got her first contract with Fox Films, but that didn't last very long, unfortunately. So while she's trying to gain work in Hollywood at the age of 19, she was in this terrible car crash. And she was on a date with this guy, and he wrecked the car. And back in those days, they didn't have that kind of safety glass. They do now. Anybody remember what windshields looked like in those days? Not too keen because shattered. Well, I am. But anyway, never mind. Not a pretty picture, but what had happened to her is she actually became scarred on her face at the age of 19, and that scar went from her forehead down through her eye and her chin. So she had to have reconstructive surgery. And for a long time after that, she had to recover from that surgery. And what she learned to do is with tricks with makeup and lighting, so you cannot see it. Can you see that? Now, Carole Lombard kind of also got typecast into what they call screwball comedies. Before that, she was in 15 short comedies right after her accident and recovery. She began appearing in short feature films. Then in 1930, she signed a contract with Paramount Pictures, and then she was cast in dramatic films. And in 1931, she married who? Not yet. Not yet. William Powell. William Powell. Can you believe it? So they were opposite personalities, okay? She was outgoing, a little bit younger, tomboyish, loved sports, was just said it like it was, foul-mouthed, broad. She would, lay it out. And of course, William Powell, he's sophisticated. He's more reserved. And people said it wasn't gonna last. And then she advocated for this match because she thought, well, opposite people should attract and they should get together because they cancel each other out and they complement each other. So that didn't last very long. So they divorced in 1934, married in 32, divorced, or 31, divorced in 34. Shortly after that, she starred with who? Clark Gable in a movie called No Man of Her Own, in which she played the wife of a con man. So that was their first pairing together in a movie. But at that time, Gable was quickly becoming a rising star in Hollywood. She's becoming rising star, powerhouse. This is going to be the big Hollywood couple down the road. So in 1934 and 5, she was starring in these screwball comedies. She even starred with her ex-husband, William Powell, in My Man Godfrey, which it's worth watching, it's funny. But another screwball comedy. But they got along enough that they could be in that movie together. she tried a couple dramatic parts. After a while, she decided that that wasn't her thing and didn't go over too well. So 4 years later, after teaming up with Gable for The No Man of Her Own, Lombard and Gable met at a party, and then they started dating. Trouble was, Clark Gable was, was married to Aria Langham, who didn't want to give him up for divorce. She didn't like that Carole was seeing him, didn't want to get that divorce. But you know, everyone's got their price. So eventually she decided, okay, I'm gonna give up on this. And she settled for $2 million in the divorce settlement. That's a lot of money. A lot of money now, it's a lot of money then. That is what she settled for, $2 million. And when she found her niche and they found their niche, they were Hollywood's big couple. They were a powerhouse. So, what happened in the United States now in 1941?
World War II.
World War II. Correct. Man, you guys are good. So Clark Gable was in charge of deciding where Hollywood actors and actresses would go for the Defense Department. He would arrange for them to go sell bonds. So he had made the arrangement for Lombard, then his wife, to go sell bonds. And she decided that she was going to go back to her hometown in Indiana. And the goal was to sell 250 to 2,500 bonds. You know, and she came, made a big speech, had the whole press conference and everything, and they ended up selling 2 million because she was so enthusiastic, which is amazing. So they initially traveled from Los Angeles to Indiana by train to get up there. And Lombard decided that she wanted to return quickly. So she thought about taking an airplane. Now, with her on that trip was Clark Gable's agent, publicity agent, and her mother. And her mother says, no, we're going to take that train back. We're not going to do it. So Carole says, look, we're going to flip a coin. And if I win, we're taking that plane. Because she wanted to get back to Los Angeles because she kind of suspected that Clark was on the sly seeing a young Lana Turner. May be true, may not be true, but that was her idea. Flip the coin, she gets them to go on that plane so they could go quickly. So what they did, they flew commercial, it was TWA Flight 3, and they stopped in Albuquerque, and 4 passengers got off to make room for 15 Army officers to get on that plane to travel on to Los Angeles. And not long after that takeoff from Burbank Airport, the plane hit the high peak in the Nevadas of Mount Potosi, and it's just 50 miles from Los Angeles. There were 22 victims in the mountainous area, and of course it was hard to reach them during the winter. And Gable, after he heard about this, chartered a plane so he could get there to the plane crash right away to see if there was anything he could do, to see if, you know, he could see her. And it's just another tragedy. So first she's got this incredible high and she sold those $2 million worth of bonds. Then she wins a bet. Hey. And then unfortunately, what they thought was the weather was bad and the actual commercial pilots miscalculated. They didn't really have instrument flying or things like that. So if it's gray and snowy, not like we have now with all these lovely computers and the whole thing. If visibility was bad, they miscalculated that height, and unfortunately, that is what happened. They consider her the first Hollywood casualty of the war, and President Roosevelt had a tribute to her, and he said, "Mrs. Roosevelt and I are deeply distressed. Carole was our friend and guest in happier days. She brought great joy to all who knew her and to the millions who knew her only as a great artist. She gave unselfishly of her time and talent to serve her government in peace and in war. She loved her country. She is and always will be a star, one we shall never cease to be grateful to." She was 33 years old. So we're going to move along to the 1950s and 60s into the era of the blonde bombshell. Close. You're so close. Jayne Mansfield. Very good. That is right. We're going to talk a little bit about Jayne Mansfield. Now, I love that picture of Sophia there giving her the side eye. Variety magazine interviewed Sophia there, and they're like, "Why are you looking at her like that? Can we ask?" And she goes, "Oh, I was just so afraid that she was going to fall out of that outfit." And, you know, she was kind of famous for, I don't want to say she invented, but she totally utilized the wardrobe malfunction. In fact, I don't know if she's like the first to have done that, but yes. So she started out at the ripe old age of 19. She marries a man, last name Mansfield. Such a young marriage. She was trying to build her career, and they didn't get along. She got rid of him, kept the name. So she became Jayne Mansfield. And when she started out, she had the idea that she wanted to distinguish herself from all the other blonde bombshells out there. So before she was in her first movie, she was a model, and she was at a photo shoot at a Jane Russell movie. And mysteriously, her swimming suit top ended up in the pool. Who knows how that happened? And of course, that got very sensationalized and quite the story. She was very into self-promotion. She liked to do many things to get attention. She started out actually as a brunette and decided that she would change her hair to blonde. And at the time, she did such a close, almost impersonation of Marilyn Monroe that Marilyn Monroe got mad and thought, "Oh, she's making fun of me, I'm going to sue her." Find a way to sue her. Which I don't think she ever found a way to sue her, but she was not too happy. So at the start of her career, she had auditions at Paramount and Warner Brothers, and she didn't get very far. So she had to take a job selling candy at the movie theater, which is... She did some modeling work after that, and actually one of her first model shoots, she was actually cropped out of the picture because GE thought she was just too sexy for the campaign for light bulbs. Go figure. Crop her out. But she kept trying. She had, in 1955, she had 2 small parts in films. But she did gain that public attention with the original wardrobe malfunction, to the point where journalists said it seems to be an occupational hazard with her that her clothes don't fit or they won't stay on. That's part of her occupational hazard, because she had suffered too many of these zipper mishaps. Nudity was definitely a professional hazard for her. Eventually, she did sign a contract with Warner Brothers, and then she was in a play called Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter, which ran for 444 shows. So that's pretty good. But actually, many more people saw her in photos than they did in her movies. So from September 1956 to May 1957, she appeared in 2,500 photos until she did a very famous photo at a magazine. Which title is?
Playboy?
Yes. Very good. Man, you're good at guessing. And at that point, Monroe thought she was doing a bad parody and wanted to sue her. Again, she really had a thing for her. And, you know, people called her the poor man's Marilyn and just called her a lot of things. But anyway, so when her career started to fizzle out after the era of these bombshells, it's getting into the 60s where Twiggy started to become a thing. And if anybody knows what Twiggy is, everybody went from curvy to Twiggy. And so Mansfield started having trouble getting work. So she ended up doing Las Vegas shows and nightclub acts and those kind of things, where she sang and danced and became a headliner. She married Mr. Universe, okay, and that was a crazy marriage with them. That was Mickey Haggerty, yes. And also, Mansfield had this idea that also to distinguish herself, that everything would be pink. She will wear pink, her car would be pink, and at that time they were living in the pink mansion together with the children. They had 3 children, and then sadly they split, and well, they didn't get along. And then in 1964, Mansfield married a director named Matt Clymer, and they wed in Mexico. But the only problem is that marriage was invalid because she didn't technically get divorced. So there seemed to be a lot of strange things in Hollywood, right? So they ended up having 1 child together before they broke up. After she broke up with those 2 guys, she was seeing her divorce attorney, and the 2 of them and the 3 children were on their way from a morning TV interview, and they had a hired driver. So they were driving back from New Orleans to head for a nightclub act in the middle of the night. So they were riding in a Buick Electra with the 3 children in the back. And shortly after 2 a.m., the car rounded a curve, and it was rainy, and it was dark. And they crashed into a slow-moving tractor-trailer truck. Now, it killed all of the front seat people. So that was the divorce attorney, the manager, and her. The 3 children in the back were injured, but they were not killed. They were injured, but they were okay. So what had happened was, back in those days, you know, when you see a tractor trailer, there is that bar comes across. Well, her accident is the reason why that law was passed, and is sometimes called the Mansfield bar. because of the law, the federal law that was passed, that all tractor trailers must carry one of those. Now, this was a horrific crash. They not only crashed in, but they went under. So that is why that car is destroyed. But the good thing that came from it was the Mansfield bar. So now we have a little bit more protection. This program is pretty long. I'm going to talk a little bit about Rebel Without a Cause for a minute, because the three principal players in this film all ended up dying tragically. But the movie was innovative in that it is one of the first feature films to show the main actors as teenager characters, and that teenagers can have very dramatic lives and possibly dangerous lives. It features them as more than just a sidekick or a little kid or whatever. It really got into problems that teens might have. It also got into this idea that even gangs could come from middle class kids, or that middle class kids could be doing dangerous things. So it was really a pivotal moment where, teens started to get recognized as, they were already recognized as a different stage of life, but this put it up on the screen. All right, we're going to talk about James Dean first. Anybody know what James Dean's real name is? James Byron Dean. Anyway, he was born in Indiana. He went to public school. He was influenced by his pastor, who was James DeWard, who also influenced his ideas about acting and racing cars. Now, in Rebel Without a Cause, one of the more dramatic scenes is when they have the chicken fight race, where the two cars race up to the cliff, and whoever jumps out is the chicken, and whoever, of course, goes over wins, but I don't think you really win. So Dean's first acting experience was in a Pepsi-Cola commercial. Then he went to New York City and he became part of the famous actor studio, where he learned method acting. After that, he was in 3 major motion pictures, and Rebel being one of those. So he had a pretty short career, but pretty good one. He had a good start. So he was also a professional race car driver. So on September 30th, 1955, Dean and his mechanic were driving his Porsche 550 Spider to a weekend race in Sausalito, California. At about 3:30 p.m., they were pulled over by the police for speeding. Then they started driving along Route 466, where a 23-year-old Polytech student named Donald Turpinseed turned into the intersection and collided with the Porsche, where the two cars had a near head-on collision. And of course, James Dean was killed, and so was the mechanic, but the other driver was okay. He was injured, but okay. So Dean was only 24. So just think of all that potential. So he's the first out of the major 3. The next principal actor is Sal Mineo. Can anybody guess what Sal Mineo's real name is? Salvador Mineo Jr. That's his real name. Okay, so he was born in Harlem, New York, and he played a lot of supporting characters. His breakout film, of course, was Rebel Without a Cause, in which he received an Academy Award nomination for that movie. He played a sensitive kid that was kind of the buddy of the two main principals. Did you also know that he was a top 40 pop singer? He had some music on the top 40 chart. So he's very versatile. He got his second Oscar nod in Exodus. He played a lot of characters on TV and a couple bit parts in movies. His career kind of went up and down. At the end of his career, he was playing in a play called P.S. I Killed Your Cat. When he was coming home from rehearsals, unfortunately, he was a victim of a robbery where he was stabbed to death. There he is. So he was only 27. Now we get to our third principal out of that, and that was Natalie Wood. Now, I think you all know a lot about Natalie Wood, child star, star of Miracle on 34th Street. Of course, there was Rebel Without a Cause. She had many ups and downs in her career. Also, in the 60s, she was in Splendor in the Grass with Warren Beatty. Also, West Side Story. And so the two movies, Rebel Without a Cause and West Side Story, are compared to modern day Romeo and Juliet kind of stories. She did very well in those. Both of those films also showcased American youth and their restlessness, some delinquency, gang activities. So she had these ups and downs, lots of movies. So by the 70s, she decides she's going to take a hiatus and raise her daughters. So she has two daughters at this point, and one is with her second husband, Richard Gregerson, and the other one is with her first and third husband, Robert Wagner, right? Because married to him, divorced, married again. So during the 70s, she only acted in 2 feature films and starred in many TV productions. In 1979, she starred in a disaster film called Meteor, The Last Married Couple in America. During her career, she starred in 56 films and TV movies. So on November 29th, 1981, Natalie Wood was found dead from drowning near Catalina Island. She was found in a flannel nightgown, a down jacket, and wool socks. So she had spent the Thanksgiving on her yacht, which was named Splendor, after Splendor in the Grass. And the dinghy to the boat was actually named Prince Valiant. And if you know about Robert Wagner, he played that character. And Christopher Walken. So, I don't know. I think Christopher Walken's kind of creepy. That's my personal opinion. But anyway. And the captain of the boat, Dennis Daverin. Now, the chief medical examiner at the time declared it an accidental drowning. Okay? And so 2 days later is the funeral, but there's still some nagging questions about that. The coroner himself even raised questions about it after he had made this thing, but of course, he wanted to know, was she untying the dinghy? Where was she going in the middle of the night? How come nobody on the boat noticed she was gone? So then the tell-all books come out, right? Tell-all books start coming out. So in 1984, Natalie Wood's sister, Lana, wrote a book, Natalie, A Memoir of My Sister. And she also wanted to know, how was it possible, with her long known she was afraid of dark water, what would she be doing possibly on a starless night, trying to escape on the dinghy. Then Robert Wagner writes his 1986 novel to try to elaborate on things. So he starts writing his novel, which he called Heart to Heart. And if you know, he was part of that detective series on television. So he says he and Walken were engaged in a political debate, and Natalie got bored. But she couldn't fall asleep because the dinghy was banging against the yacht, and she must have tried to untie it or tie it up, and she fell and hit her head, probably. But his book had a different account, surprisingly, than what he had told the police at the time. At the time, he said that the argument was about Natalie spending too much time away from the family. Anyway, in a Vanity Fair interview in 2000, the captain said that Wood and Walken were flirting with each other throughout the weekend, and that things turned nasty with all the drinking, and that Wagner smashed a wine bottle and said, "Are you trying to get with my wife?" to Walken. And then Natalie got mad, she stormed off. Supposedly Wagner went to their cabin and the two of them got into a scuffle, according to the captain, and he said he heard a lot of banging and clanging and fighting and shouting and yelling. He called it an epic fight. This is in the article in Vanity Fair. And he claimed he heard the dinghy being untied before seeing Wagner coming up from the stairs sweating profusely. So then Wagner and the captain stayed up for more drinks at 1:30, and then Wagner went to check on Natalie but couldn't find her. And then Davern, the captain, he said he wanted to look for her too. He wanted to turn on the floodlights and look for her in the water, but Wagner said, "No, we're not going to disrupt all these people. We're not going to get their attention around us. Let's don't do anything. We don't want to alert all the people." Nothing suspicious about that at all. Then finally, Wagner radios for help. Now, here's another book by Wagner. 2008, Pieces of My Heart. And in this book, Wagner says there's only two possibilities. Either Natalie was trying to get away from the argument, or she was trying to tie the dinghy. But the bottom line is no one knows exactly what happened. Then finally, Davern writes his book, Goodbye Natalie, Goodbye Splendor, and it is published in 2009. And that's when he elaborates on the story. And then in 2011, the case is reclassified as suspicious by the LA coroner. And he thought maybe it was drowning and that there were undetermined factors, citing the bruises suggested that Wood was assaulted. In 2018, the sheriff classified the death as suspicious and named Wagner as a person of interest. But Wagner, he's in his 90s now, has since decided not to talk to anybody about this ever again. So that is where it's at, and that is the end of it. So there is your program. I'm glad you came today. Thank you.